Hey everybody, Daniel from Spacedock here with an unscripted top 5 video, this time looking at my top 5 sci-fi carriers. That's proper carriers, not Star Destroyers or Battleship Carrier hybrids or Battlestars or anything like that. I'm talking about carriers that are portrayed as proper support vessels requiring an escort group designed entirely to store and launch strike craft. So let's get right into it. In 5th place, and from the new Star Wars canon, is the Quasar Fire class Imperial Light Carrier. This was built by the Sullustan Sorosub Corporation, who you normally don't see building ships for the Empire, and from a behind-the-scenes standpoint, it's of course based on the old Quasar Fire class bulk cruiser from Legends. I much prefer this new canon version. It looks far more military and slick and organised, and as I think maybe a theme going through this video, it is suitably simple in its design. It has 4 large launch bays, well positioned, well laid out. In the episodes of Rebels we see it appear in, we can clearly tell that they are divided for bombers and shuttles and fighters, and although this ship has unfortunately developed kind of hero ship syndrome, where it's been used by the good guys so many times that the studios are now afraid to show it used in its actual role in case it confuses the viewers, I would like to see this more in Imperial fleets in future Star Wars productions, because it does fit really well into the very nicely organised fleet structure of the Empire in the new canon. It can carry 48 starfighters and is purportedly used as a defensive ship most often, as a cheap way of placing a garrison above an Imperial planet or outpost that doesn't necessarily demand the placement of a Star Destroyer or a fleet of ships. An interesting thing to point out is that the ship's bridge is actually supported on a ventral structure rather than sticking out of the top like on most Imperial designs, and thankfully the ship is not covered in heavy turbo lasers or anything else that would turn it into a super do-everything ship and completely defeat the point of its specialised design, which is something I always like to see in science fiction, as many of you well know. An interesting point is that the Rebel Files sourcebook refers to these ships as having micro-fracture risks in their designs as a result of poor structural support in the space frame that sometimes leads to issues when exiting hyperspace. First of all, huge props for somebody actually writing a flaw into a ship in science fiction, because frankly that does not happen very often. Normally we only ever hear about how great everything is at various things, and it's nice little quirks like this that provide a lot of grounding and realism for the world, because a lot of the time warships like this and other military assets do get poorly designed or pushed through bureaucracy, which causes them to have major problems and need to be replaced or forgotten about and left in service, causing problems for longer than they should be. These kind of things happen in a realistic society, and this is something that I tried to apply when I did the Leonidas class backstory for the Expanse Force Recon. Overall though, I love the visual style of this ship, I love the sensible utilitarian nature of it, I wish we'd seen it more in Imperial hands in Rebels, and I hope we continue to see it in future Star Wars productions. In 4th place, from Battlestar Galactica, the Cylon Basestar in its second Cylon War iteration. I really love this design. It's such a striking and iconic frame. In fact, I think it deserves quite a lot more respect than it gets as a truly classic sci-fi design, especially for an antagonist faction. Whereas the Colonial Battlestars are more balanced between being carriers and being battleships, Cylon Basestars lean a lot more heavily towards the carrier end. They're not particularly maneuverable or fast. They carry only strategic missile weapons, although they carry a hell of a lot of them, which has of course caused many tactical problems that I've described in a previous video. But in general, the Basestar leans far more heavily on its strike craft, of which it carries a huge number in these fantastic toast rack style docking bays along the insides of the pylon arms. I always love seeing an innovative and interesting fighter launch system on a sci-fi carrier design. The main issue with this ship, as I've described in a previous Spacedock short, is not really with the design of the ship itself, but rather with how the Cylons have used it, because basically this ship serves as the only warship in the Cylon fleet worth a damn. They use this for everything, despite the fact that it is clearly a specialised carrier and missile platform. For 4 years they chased the Galactica with this thing, trying to use it as though it's a cruiser or a battleship, and its lack of ballistic weapons causes them to fail again and again and again. That doesn't mean this ship itself is bad, it just means that it was crying out for some kind of proper escort or more varied fleet composition throughout this whole time. This ship also gave us some of the coolest set designs in the whole show, with a great degree of variation between the areas. The hangar bays and engineering areas of the Basestar are muscle red and filled with all of the kind of bioorganic technology that we see inside the Raiders, and then when you move into the central command areas, it starts to look more like an Apple store or the bridge of the JJ Trek Enterprise or something like that. They also have lots of interesting lore points, such as their connection to the colony and the hybrids, the whole idea of Cylon projection, and they're seeing different environments as they navigate around the inside of the ship. They managed to keep this general theme of threatening alien mystery about them all the way through the series. Overall, just a fantastic design. I particularly like how these ships can reconfigure into a tandem Y shape when they're doing orbital bombardments, as we see in the plan, but I'm glad that's not their general configuration, because the inverted symmetry of the design from any angle is something that is really striking about the ship that I really like seeing. Basestar is a very appropriate name for something that is essentially almost a space station. It's a ship that is clearly designed to jump in and serve as a platform for missiles and fighters, and it always makes for a really imposing and impressive presence on the screen in any battle sequence in the show. Great design overall, deserves to be cited far more often as a classic sci-fi warship design. In third place, the Bengal-class carrier. No, not that one. This one, the original one from Wing Commander. I don't hate the Star Citizen interpretation, but I do prefer the original. Largely because it manages to pull something off that a lot of people try and do but normally get wrong. And that is to take heavy inspiration from real-life aircraft carriers without ending up designing something that doesn't make any sense at all. Because this style can look really cool, and it can result in some awesome designs like the X2 version of the Teladi Condor, or the Yorktown class, also from Wing Commander. But a lot of the time it will result in something that looks great but doesn't survive any kind of analysis at all, and the best example of this is the Retribution from Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. A ship that looks pretty great, but then you realise that it's actually using remote-controlled drones to force pilots in fighters to pretend there's gravity and roll along the runway before stopping because it cannot escape the obsession with being a seagoing aircraft carrier in space. That is lunacy, and I'm glad to say that the Bengal class manages to avoid that. This ship has Battlestar Galactica-style launch tubes on the port and starboard side. It uses its big forward runway-style sloping area as a retrieval bay, as well it should, and it has a nice balanced widening frame towards the back. It looks great from just about every angle. It's got ATC towers and various other modern seagoing military features, while still having sensible grounded spacefaring design elements to stop it from being literally a flying boat. There have been some incredible modern fan remasters and HD models of this ship, which I'm sure Alistair will have edited into this video. Unfortunately, the limitations of the time meant that we didn't get to see the ship in all her glory in the original game because she was about 18 pixels, but even then you could see that the space frame was a very cool shape and a very cool style. I must say I'm personally not too fond of the old green and grey Confederation colour scheme. I preferred it after they went to the naval blue colours later on, but I do wish this class of ship had stuck around into Wing Commander 3 and 4 as a background element or something, because it really is a very, very cool design. Just to roll out some stats, the ship has a crew of 550, it's 700 meters long, carries 104 fighters, which is a rather large number for a ship of this size. It's reported to have extremely poor acceleration, which is fair enough given its apparent mass, and carries only 8 dual-mount point defense turrets. It is a proper carrier. It can just about defend itself and shoot down some missiles, but it needs to have a battle group with it if it wants to engage anything serious. This is the kind of ship that makes for such an immersive and fantastic setting for any sci-fi story, and it will never get old watching that classic Wing Commander cutscene of the silhouetted pilots running to their fighters from the ready room with the iconic music playing in the background. This is a ship that did a fantastic job of making itself the player's home and the player's investment, and fully endearing the player to its survival and its well-being. A good hero ship should be a character unto itself, and this ship pulled that off without fail. In second place, the Colonial Atlas class carrier from the fantastic Battlestar Galactica Deadlock. This ship again takes the simple and brilliant idea of basically just being a massive flight pod. It takes 1/3 of the Battlestar Galactica and turns it into a ship unto itself. Great idea, perfectly logical design choice for a colonial carrier, and results in something that just looks great through its simplicity. The ship is essentially a massive superstructure hangar running through the middle of this long design, flat along the top, and it is loaded to the gills with mag rails, shuttles and loading lifts for Raptors and Vipers and Sweepers, carrying a huge complement of strike craft and shielding them beneath an extremely dense and resilient hull to avoid secondary explosions or fuel line strikes or anything like that. This is one of my favourite ships to use in Deadlock, especially in the new survival mode because it's just such a brick. It takes a lot of wearing down to take any damage, and although its offensive abilities are limited, the artillery batteries it does have on its broadsides can provide a nice continuous barrage of fire from a long distance while the fighters are doing their job. It looks great, just like every other Deadlock design. It fits beautifully into the style set forth in the RDM Battlestar series. It wouldn't look an inch out of place on the show itself, in the Scorpion fleet yards, in Razor, or anything else. And by its very existence, it shows that true, proper carriers do exist in the Battlestar universe for the Colonials, and makes the Battlestars themselves fully established as this jack-of-all-trades ship that is not necessarily as good at being a carrier as a dedicated vessel could be. Great design, fun to play with, looks brilliant, and fits into the Battlestar Colonial aesthetic flawlessly. And in first place, we're back to Wing Commander. You'll have to forgive me for the prevalence of Wing Commander in this list. It's largely because it is a series about carriers. But here we are in first place with the Vesuvius class heavy carrier, as seen in Wing Commander 4 and I think briefly in Wing Commander Prophecy Secret Ops. This ship is great because it takes the often overdone idea of a battleship carrier hybrid and does it properly, because this ship is still a carrier. It is only slightly better at fighting other warships than a carrier normally would be. It's got 24 dual-mount laser turrets, 16 antimatter guns, 16 mass drivers, and 2 torpedo tubes. But almost all of its frame is still dedicated to its through-deck hangar bay. It's referred to as a heavy carrier, not as a Star Destroyer or a Battlestar or whatever else. And the way it's framed in the narrative, it is a grand, secret project, a huge deal. They go miles out of their way for years to design this ship that can be a true fleet carrier whilst also being a battleship, and the end result is something that clearly leans in the direction of being a carrier still, because it recognizes the fact that making a ship that can do everything brilliantly is extremely difficult, and from a narrative standpoint, rather boring. It also plays on the aircraft carrier in space style very well, mostly by having a covered and enclosed flight deck running through the center, and then keeping the seagoing naval tower designs and flat surface along the top, as with the earlier Yorktown and Concordia classes from the same game. The ship carries 400 fighters, which is of course a very large contingent. It's 1,600 meters long, with a crew of 7,800, and actually seems to be rather quick for its size, as we see it chasing and being chased by the Intrepid and later the TCS St. Helens in Wing Commander 4, The Price of Freedom. For me, this was my favourite point the Confederation reached in ship design in the series. After this, they went on to the Midway class, which was this big experimental supercarrier thing, which just struck me as a bit of a sort of technical nightmare. It has all these like big monorail systems for bringing fighters to the launch bays from the other side of the ship, and it was too big for its own good. That was when the series, I think, finally went into irritating Star Wars Battlestar style do everything ship territory. The Vesuvius was the most advanced they managed to get, while still keeping the specialized flying carrier nature of this ship at the center of its design philosophy, and that was fantastic. It also makes for one of the most exhilarating sequences in gaming, where you have to fly through the center of this thing to deploy the flash pack in Wing Commander 4. Really awesome sequence, really awesome ship. If you've not played the Wing Commander games, I strongly recommend you check it out. We'll be starting to stream Wing Commander 4 quite soon, I think, on the Spacedock Twitch channel. If you're watching this at the time the video was released, you can find a link to our Twitch channel in the description below. Now, I may do another video in the future dealing more with hybrid battleship carrier designs. While I am not necessarily fond of that concept too much, there are many ships that fall into that area that are among my favourite designs ever, simply because so many of my favourite visual designs fall into that distinction, the Venator-class Star Destroyer and the Mercury-class Battlestar being obvious candidates. But please do let me know below if you've enjoyed this video, if you have any other ideas for unscripted top 5 videos on Spacedock. Thank you all for listening. This is Daniel from Spacedock, signing off. Thank you for watching Spacedock. Please remember to like, subscribe and share for more science fiction spacecraft summaries. If you enjoy the channel, why not consider pledging your support on Patreon? For just $1 a month, you'll be able to access the Spacedock schedule to see what's coming up.